I never thought my marriage would be the kind that ends up as fodder for one of those late-night TV dramas. Yet, there I was, staring at the receipts she'd left on the kitchen counter. Not the kind of receipt you'd expect to uncover a betrayal. Just a charge for a Pilates class at a boutique studio across town. But something about it felt off. Julie had always been an open book with me, or at least I thought so. She'd laugh at my bad jokes, roll her eyes when I left my socks on the couch, and kiss me goodnight even after a fight. But lately, she'd been distant, her laughter forced, her smiles a little too quick to vanish. And now, Pilates? She hated Pilates. "It's for my back," she'd said when I asked her about it a week ago. "You know how tense I get after work." Sure, I thought. She was a marketing exec with a high-pressure job. It made sense. But the subtle change in her tone, the way she avoided my eyes, that didn't. I shook my head, telling myself I was being paranoid. Still, I couldn't help but notice the patterns. The long showers she took after coming home. The sudden late nights catching up with her best friend, Rachel. And now, the receipt for a studio halfway across the city. That night, as we sat down to dinner, I studied her like I hadn't in years. Julie looked beautiful, of course. She always did. Her dark hair fell in soft waves around her face, and her green eyes sparkled under the dim light of our dining room. But there was something else there too, something I couldn't place. "So, how's Rachel?" I asked casually, swirling my fork through the spaghetti she'd made. Julie stiffened for a fraction of a second, so brief I almost missed it. "She's good. Just stressed with work." "Oh yeah? You've been spending a lot of time with her lately." Her fork paused midair, and she gave me a tight smile. "She needs me right now. You know how she gets." I nodded, pretending to buy it. But the pit in my stomach grew heavier. Rachel wasn't the kind of person who needed anyone. She was sharp-tongued and independent to a fault. It didn't add up. Later that evening, when Julie went to shower, I found myself standing in front of her laptop on the kitchen table. I told myself I wouldn't look. I trusted her. We'd been married for 8 years. What could she possibly hide from me? And yet, my fingers moved almost of their own accord. Her email opened easily enough. She'd never bothered to change the password. I skimmed through the messages, feeling ridiculous and guilty, until I saw his name, Zach Miller. The subject line read, "Amazing session today." I clicked on it before I could second-guess myself. The email was short, but the words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Julie, you were incredible today. Your form has improved so much. It's inspiring to watch. Can't wait for our next session. You always make my day. Zach." I stared at the screen, my mind racing. The words weren't outright damning, but there was something intimate about them. Something that didn't belong in a professional relationship, or any relationship outside of us. The shower turned off, and I quickly closed the laptop, my heart hammering in my chest. Julie walked into the room moments later, her hair wrapped in a towel, her face flushed from the steam. "Hey," she said, her voice soft. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." I forced a smile, the weight of the email pressing down on me. "Yeah, just tired." But deep down, I knew I wouldn't rest until I got to the bottom of this. Something wasn't right, and I wasn't going to ignore it any longer. I barely slept that night. The email from Zach played on a loop in my mind. Each word magnified, twisted, dissected. I told myself it could be innocent, a fitness instructor motivating his client, nothing more. But the way Julie had been acting, the way she avoided my gaze, it felt like the universe was dropping breadcrumbs, daring me to follow them. The next day, I called in sick to work. It wasn't a hard sell. My boss barely paid attention to us as long as the quarterly numbers looked good. Julie had already left for her morning class when I decided to drive to the studio listed on the receipt. The boutique Pilates studio was tucked into a trendy neighborhood I'd only visited a handful of times. The windows were frosted, offering just enough privacy to make me feel like an outsider before I even stepped inside. The receptionist, a bubbly woman in her 20s, greeted me with a smile that faltered slightly when I asked about Julie. "Oh, Julie comes in for Zach's sessions," she said, her tone turning a shade warmer. "He's amazing, isn't he?" All our clients adore him. Yeah, I said, forcing a grin. He's got quite the reputation. She nodded eagerly. Totally. He's so hands-on, you know? Really committed to helping his clients achieve their goals. Hands-on. The phrase lingered in the air, souring in my mind. I left the studio before I could press her further, feeling like the walls were closing in on me. When Julie came home that evening, I couldn't keep the edge out of my voice. So, how was Pilates? Her eyes flicked to mine, her smile faltering just enough for me to notice. Good. Why? Just curious, I said, trying to sound nonchalant. You seem to be going a lot these days. It helps me relax, she said, her tone defensive. What's with the third degree? Nothing, I replied, raising my hands in mock surrender. Just making conversation. But her reaction had already spoken volumes. She was hiding something, and now I was certain of it. That night, while Julie slept, I scrolled through her social media accounts. She was meticulous about keeping her profiles clean. No incriminating photos, no suspicious comments. But there was one thing I noticed: Zach's account. He wasn't one of her followers, but his profile wasn't private, and curiosity got the better of me. Zach was younger than I'd expected, maybe mid-30s, with the kind of sculpted physique that made other men feel inadequate. His posts were a mix of motivational quotes, workout videos, and the occasional candid shot with a female client. But it was one picture in particular that stopped me cold. It was a group photo taken during what seemed to be a post-class coffee meetup. Julie was there, smiling in the background, standing just a little too close to Zach. My stomach churned as I stared at the image, my mind racing with questions. The following day, I decided to confront her. As she sat across from me at breakfast, sipping her coffee, I blurted out the words that had been eating away at me. Julie, is there something you want to tell me? She looked up, startled. What do you mean? You've been different lately, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Secretive, distant. And then there's this Pilates thing. It doesn't add up. Her cheeks flushed, and for a moment, I thought she might deny it. But then she sighed, setting her mug down with a soft thud. I knew you'd start asking questions eventually. Her words hit me like a slap. So there is something. Julie looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring nervously. It's not what you think, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Zach and we've been talking, but it's not serious. I didn't mean for it to happen. I stared at her, the room spinning around me. Talking, I said, my voice rising. What the hell does that mean, Julie? She looked at me, tears welling in her eyes. I've been unhappy, okay? For a long time. And Zach, he listens to me. He makes me feel seen. Her words cut deeper than any knife could. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but all I could do was sit there, stunned. How long? I finally managed to ask. Julie hesitated, and in that hesitation, I felt the weight of her betrayal. A few months, she admitted. But it's not physical. I swear. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to. But something in her eyes told me there was more to the story. Something she wasn't ready to tell. Couldn't breathe. Her words, her excuses, they swirled around me like smoke in a burning building. It's not physical, she'd said. But I knew better than to take her at her word. People didn't twist wedding rings nervously or avoid eye contact over something trivial. Months, Julie? I said, my voice cracking. Months, and you didn't think to tell me you were… What? Emotionally leaning on another man? Pouring your heart out to him while I'm here? Oblivious. She looked away, tears streaming down her face. I didn't mean for it to get this far, Tom. I didn't mean… I interrupted, slamming my hand on the table. You didn't mean for it to get this far, but you kept going. You kept lying. You let it build. Julie flinched but didn't argue. That silence, that damned silence, felt like confirmation of every fear I'd been trying to ignore. That day, I took a walk to clear my head, ending up at a park we used to visit before life got too busy. The bench where we'd once shared sandwiches and stories felt alien now. I sat there, trying to piece together where it had all gone wrong. Had I been distant? Had I overlooked her needs? The self-doubt clawed at me, making it harder to separate my anger from my pain. Still, no amount of reflection could justify what she'd done. I pulled out my phone and stared at the group photo from Zach's profile again. Julie's smile wasn't the forced one she'd been giving me lately. It was genuine, radiant. And Zach? His arm was casually slung across her shoulders, his face smug in a way that made my blood boil. I scrolled through more of his posts, and that's when I found it. A video clip from a Pilates class. Julie was front and center, her movements graceful, her focus entirely on Zach as he demonstrated an exercise. His voice carried over the background music, warm and encouraging. But there was a familiarity in his tone that felt too intimate for a simple trainer-client relationship. That evening, I decided to push further. "Why Zach?" I asked as we sat in the living room, the silence between us heavy. Julie looked at me, her eyes red and swollen. "It just happened. I didn't go looking for it, Tom. He listened when I felt like you weren't." Her words stung, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Listen to what exactly? What did I miss?" She hesitated, her hands twisting together. I felt invisible, like we're just going through the motions. And Zach, he noticed me. He made me feel alive again. Her words hit me like a sledgehammer. "Alive? You think betraying me makes you alive?" "No," she said quickly. "I didn't want to hurt you. I've been trying to fix this, Tom. To fix us." "By running to another man?" I shot back. "That's your idea of fixing it?" Julie buried her face in her hands, sobbing. "I made a mistake, okay? A huge mistake. But it wasn't physical. I swear it wasn't." The words felt hollow now, repeated like a mantra she hoped would absolve her. But the more I thought about Zach's smug face, his hands on her shoulders, the way she glowed in his presence, the harder it became to believe her. A week passed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. I needed answers, so I decided to get them the only way I knew how. I went back to the studio, this time during one of Julie's sessions. I parked across the street and watched as clients filtered in. When I finally spotted her, she wasn't alone. Zach walked alongside her, laughing at something she'd said. I clenched the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. The ease between them, the casual intimacy, it was more than I could take. I got out of the car and marched toward the studio. Inside, the receptionist's face lit up with recognition. "Oh, hi. You're back. I need to speak to Zach," I said, my voice tight. She looked surprised but nodded. "He's just finishing a session. Let me grab him." A few minutes later, Zach appeared, his expression polite but cautious. "Hey, can I help you?" "Yeah," I said, my jaw clenched. "You can tell me what the hell's been going on between you and my wife." His eyes widened slightly, but he recovered quickly, giving me a smooth smile. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. Julie's a client, that's all." "Cut the crap," I snapped. "I've seen the way you look at her. The way she looks at you." Zach raised his hands in mock surrender. "Look, man, I get it. You're upset. But I've never crossed a line with Julie. Whatever issues you're having, that's between you two." His words were calm, reasonable even, but there was something in his tone that felt smug, like he was daring me to prove him wrong. When I got home that evening, Julie was waiting for me, her face pale. "Zach called," she said, her voice trembling. "He said you came to the studio." "Yeah, I did," I said flatly, "because I'm tired of being lied to." Her eyes filled with tears. "Tom, please, I told you the truth. It's not what you think." But the cracks in her story were growing wider, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold it together. Julie's tears didn't move me this time. I felt like I was standing in the eye of a hurricane, calm on the outside, but chaos brewing just beneath the surface. "You've told me the truth?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "Then why does it feel like there's still more you're not saying?" She opened her mouth, then closed it, her hesitation twisting the knife further. "Tom, I..." "Spit it out, Julie," I snapped, my voice rising. Because if you don't, I'm done playing these games. I deserve to know exactly what's been going on. Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought she'd finally come clean. Instead, she whispered, "You're right. You do deserve the truth." I waited, my heart pounding in my chest. "It started out innocent," she said, her voice barely audible. "Just casual conversations after class. But then, I don't know. He started paying attention to me in a way I hadn't felt in years. And I let it happen. I let myself like it. I clenched my fists, trying to rein in the storm of emotions swirling inside me. And Julie looked up at me, her eyes wide and pleading. It wasn't physical. Not at first. My breath hitched. At first. Her silence was deafening. When? I demanded, my voice cracking. When did it cross the line? It was one time, she said quickly, as if that made it better. I swear, just once. I was confused, and it was a mistake. I regretted it the second it happened. Her words felt like a hammer blow to my chest. One time or 100, the betrayal was the same. I needed air. Without another word, I grabbed my jacket and walked out the door, ignoring Julie's frantic calls behind me. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay in that house. Not after what I just heard. I ended up at a dive bar on the outskirts of town, nursing a drink that tasted like regret and cheap whiskey. The TV flickered in the corner, some mindless sports game playing on mute. The bartender gave me a sympathetic nod, like he'd seen 100 versions of me before. As I sat there, staring at the amber liquid in my glass, a thought struck me. What if there was more to this than Julie had admitted? People didn't just wake up one day and decide to cheat. There had to be a build-up, a catalyst. And then, like a lightning bolt, it hit me. Rachel, Julie's best friend. The one she'd been spending so much time with lately. The one who conveniently kept Julie's secrets while telling me nothing. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to Rachel's number. My thumb hovered over the call button. Did I really want to open that door? The next morning, I stood on Rachel's doorstep, my hands shoved deep into my pockets to keep them from shaking. She opened the door, her expression shifting from surprise to unease when she saw me. "Tom," she said, forcing a smile. "What brings you here?" "We need to talk," I said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Rachel closed the door behind me, her movements hesitant. "Look, if this is about Julie." "It is," I interrupted, my tone sharper than I intended. "And I'm not leaving until you tell me everything you know." Rachel crossed her arms, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Cut the act, Rachel," I said, my voice rising. "I know you've been covering for her. I know she's been using you as an excuse to see Zach. So don't stand there and pretend you're innocent in all this." Her eyes darted to the floor, and for a moment, I thought she might deny it. But then she sighed, her shoulders slumping. "Fine," she said quietly. "You're right. I've been covering for her." My stomach dropped. "How long?" Rachel hesitated, and I could see the battle playing out on her face. Finally, she said, "A year." I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "A year," I echoed, my voice trembling. Rachel nodded, her eyes filled with guilt. She didn't know how to stop Tom. She was scared, confused. And I didn't know how to help her. Her words barely registered. A year. A whole year of lies, of secrets, of betrayal. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice breaking. Rachel looked at me, her expression pained. "Because she begged me not to. She said she'd fix it, that she still loved you. I thought she'd come to her senses before it was too late." "Well, guess what?" I said bitterly. "It's too late now." As I left Rachel's house, a new wave of anger coursed through me. Not just at Julie, but at Rachel too. They'd both betrayed me in their own ways, both chosen to keep me in the dark while they played their games. When I got home, Julie was waiting for me, her face pale and drawn. "Where were you?" she asked softly. "Talking to Rachel," I said, my voice cold. Her eyes widened, and I saw the panic set in. "Tom, please, Save it, I snapped. I know everything now. A whole year, Julie. How could you do this to me? To us? She opened her mouth to respond, but I didn't let her. You don't get to explain anymore, I said, my voice shaking with fury. You've already said enough. I'm done listening to your excuses. The look on her face was one of pure devastation, but I didn't care. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sliver of clarity, a sense of control in the chaos. Julie sat down on the couch, her hands trembling as she clasped them together. I stood in the doorway, keeping as much distance between us as the room would allow. Her tears were flowing freely now, but they didn't stir the sympathy they once would have. Tom, she began, her voice hoarse. Don't, I said, cutting her off. I've heard enough apologies. They don't mean anything when they're followed by lies. Her head dropped, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of a year's worth of betrayal hung between us, suffocating the air in the room. I didn't plan for any of this, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't wake up one day and decide to hurt you. I felt so lost, so disconnected. And Zach, he made me feel like I mattered. I laughed bitterly, the sound sharp and hollow. Mattered? You think that's an excuse for what you did? For lying to my face, day after day, for an entire year? I was wrong, she admitted, her voice cracking. I know that, but I was scared, Tom. Scared of losing you. Scared of admitting how broken I felt. Her words stung, but they weren't enough to pierce the armor of anger I'd built around myself. So you chose to betray me instead? I asked. You chose him? Julie shook her head frantically. It was never about choosing him over you. It was about filling a void I didn't know how to fix. But I never stopped loving you. Not for a second. I wanted to believe her. God, a part of me still wanted to cling to the life we'd built, to the woman I thought I knew. But her actions had burned a hole through the foundation of our marriage, and I wasn't sure it could ever be repaired. The next few days were a blur of silence and avoidance. Julie tried to bridge the chasm between us, but I couldn't bring myself to engage. Every word, every gesture felt hollow, tainted by the weight of her betrayal. Then, just as I thought I'd reached the bottom of the abyss, another twist hit me like a freight train. I was sorting through the mail one evening when I found an envelope addressed to Julie. The handwriting was unfamiliar, and there was no return address. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice about it. But now, everything felt suspicious. I opened it, my hands shaking. Inside was a single piece of paper with a short, handwritten note. You're making a mistake. He'll never forgive you for this. No signature. No clue as to who had sent it. But the implications were clear. Someone else knew about Julie's affair. Someone who was warning her to walk away. I confronted her immediately, holding the note up like a piece of damning evidence. What the hell is this? I demanded. Julie's face went pale when she saw it. Where did you get that? It was in the mail, I said. Now answer the question. Who sent this? Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes darting around the room like she was searching for an escape. I don't know, she stammered. Don't lie to me, I snapped. You've done enough of that already. She took a deep, shuddering breath. It's Zach, she admitted finally. He didn't want me to tell you. He thought it would ruin everything. My jaw clenched, rage bubbling to the surface. Ruin everything? What, your little fantasy life with him? Was he planning on replacing me completely? Or was this just a game to him? Julie shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I don't know. I never asked him to send that. I didn't even know he'd written it. Her words only fueled my anger. Zach had crossed a line. Several lines, actually. And I wasn't about to let him get away with it. The next day, I returned to the studio, this time with a purpose. I didn't care about the stares or the receptionist's protests as I stormed past her desk. Zach was leading a class, his voice cheerful and commanding, until he saw me standing in the doorway. Tom, he said, his tone turning wary. This isn't the time. You made it the time, I interrupted, stepping into the room. The clients froze, their eyes darting between us like spectators at a boxing match. "You think you can mess with my wife and my life and get away with it?" I said, my voice rising. "You think you can send her letters, manipulate her, and walk away unscathed?" Zach raised his hands in a placating gesture, but his smug expression remained. "I didn't manipulate anyone. Julie made her own choices." The words hit like a slap, but I didn't back down. "Stay away from her," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "From both of us. If I see your face again, you'll regret it." He didn't respond, his silence speaking volumes. I turned and walked out, the weight of the confrontation lifting slightly, but the pain of Julie's betrayal still anchored deep in my chest. When I got home, Julie was waiting for me, her face etched with worry. "I heard what you did," she said softly. "Good," I replied. "I meant every word." She took a step closer, her voice trembling. "What now, Tom? What happens to us?" I looked at her, my heart aching with the weight of everything we'd lost. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I do know this. I'm not going to live like this anymore. You need to figure out what you want, Julie. And if it's not me, then you need to let me go." Her sobs filled the silence, but I didn't comfort her this time. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was reclaiming a piece of myself. A piece I wasn't willing to give away again. The house was eerily quiet the next morning. Julie had taken the guest room, leaving our bedroom feeling hollow and unfamiliar. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair across from me. It used to be her spot, where she'd sip her coffee, scrolling through her phone with that soft half-smile she didn't know I loved. Now, all I could see was the ghost of what we'd had and the shadow of what we'd lost. I spent the day going through the motions, work emails, a quick grocery run, even fixing the leaky faucet in the bathroom. But no matter how much I tried to distract myself, the knot in my chest refused to loosen. That evening, Julie approached me cautiously, like I was a fragile thing she might shatter with the wrong move. "Tom," she said softly, "can we talk?" I nodded, though part of me dreaded what she might say. She sat down across from me, wringing her hands nervously. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about figuring out what I want. And," I asked, my tone neutral. Tears welled in her eyes, and she took a deep breath. "I want us. I want to fix this, to rebuild what we've lost. But I know it's not that simple. I know I've broken your trust, and that might never come back. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to try." Her words hung in the air, heavy with both sincerity and desperation. I stared at her, searching for any trace of the woman I'd fallen in love with, the woman I thought I'd known. "Why now, Julie?" I asked. "Why do you suddenly care about fixing this after everything that's happened?" Her voice broke as she replied, "Because I realized how much I stand to lose. You've always been there for me, Tom. My rock, my safe place. And I threw it all away for something that never meant anything. I see that now, and I hate myself for it." For a moment, I almost believed her. But the scars she'd left weren't the kind that healed with apologies. The following weeks were a blur of counseling sessions, uncomfortable conversations, and awkward silences. Julie threw herself into trying to make amends, canceling her Pilates membership, cutting all ties with Zach, and even agreeing to individual therapy. But trust isn't something you can rebuild overnight. Every time she hugged me, I wondered if her arms had ever felt the same around him. Every time she said, "I love you," I questioned whether those words had been shared with someone else. One evening, during a particularly raw counseling session, our therapist asked me a question I hadn't dared to confront yet. "Tom, do you still want this marriage?" The room went silent, Julie's breath hitching as she waited for my answer. "I don't know," I said finally, my voice trembling. "I love her. I do. But I don't know if love is enough to erase what's happened. I don't know if I can look at her the same way again." Julie broke down in tears, and I felt the familiar ache in my chest. But this time I didn't reach out to comfort her. This time I let her sit with the weight of her actions. A few days later I made a decision. "Julie," I said one morning, as we sat at the kitchen table, I need time, space, to figure out who I am without all this noise. Her face crumpled, but she nodded. I understand, she said softly. I'll do whatever you need. We agreed to a trial separation. I moved into a small apartment downtown, a place with creaky floors and outdated appliances, but just enough warmth to feel like a fresh start. At first, the loneliness was unbearable. Nights stretched into endless hours of silence, and the memories of better times haunted me. But slowly, I started to rediscover pieces of myself I'd forgotten. I picked up old hobbies, woodworking, running, even cooking meals that didn't come from a box. I reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in years, people who reminded me of who I was before my world fell apart. Julie and I kept in touch, mostly through sporadic texts and the occasional phone call. She gave me updates on her therapy, her job, her efforts to change. I could tell she was trying, genuinely trying. But the space between us gave me clarity I hadn't expected. One evening, as I sat in my tiny apartment, the smell of fresh sawdust in the air, I realized something. I didn't miss the life we'd had. I missed the idea of it, the version of our marriage that existed in my mind but never truly in reality. A month later, we met for coffee at a small cafe near the park. Julie looked different, more grounded, less frantic. So, she said, stirring her tea. How have you been? Better, I admitted, figuring things out. You? She nodded. The same. Therapy's been eye-opening, painful but necessary. We sat in silence for a moment before she looked up at me, her eyes filled with both hope and resignation. Have you made a decision? I took a deep breath, the words heavy on my tongue. I think it's time we let each other go, Julie. For good. Her face fell, but she nodded slowly. I understand, she said, her voice trembling. I want you to be happy, Tom, even if it's not with me. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. It wasn't the ending I'd wanted, but it was the one I needed. Months later, as I stood in my workshop, sanding down the edges of a new project, I realized I wasn't just rebuilding furniture. I was rebuilding myself one piece at a time. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't afraid of what came next. I was ready to embrace it,